My name is Joseph Daher, and I am a part-time affiliate professor in the framework of the Wartime and Post-Conflict in Syria project of the Middle East Direction Program at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies. I'm very happy to welcome you all for this roundtable at the Middle East Direction Program European University Institute. This webinar is organized in the framework of the Wartime and Post-Conflict in Syria project, a project funded by the European Union and which counts so far more than 40 publications, all available on our dedicated website in English and Arabic. Before introducing briefly, I remind you a few guidelines for this webinar. I'll give you the floor. I'll give the floor to our speakers for around 45 minutes, and the first part of the event, the presentation, will be video recorded. Then we'll open for Q&A, and Chatham House rules will apply to the Q&A session. If you wish to intervene during the Q&A sessions, please submit your question in written form in English or in Arabic to the public chat, or raise your hand at the end of the presentation. Now, regarding the topic of the day and our seminar that we entitled The Energy Crisis in Syria, Reasons and Outcomes. As you may know, the Syrian energy sector has been radically affected by more than 10 years of conflict. A major transformation of energy policies has occurred in the last decade that has further impaired the state's governance system and infrastructure. The destruction and damage caused to energy infrastructure alongside the imposition of international sanctions, depriving Syria of sufficient energy resources, have profoundly impacted the economy and society. The productive sectors of the economy, such as manufacturing and agriculture, have suffered from a lack or interruptions of essential services and energy resources as a main obstacle to them continuing their activities. In this seminar, our invited expert will provide assessments of the Syria's energy sector before and during the conflict and discuss its prospects. They will present details of the Syrian government response to the crisis and will also attempt to predict the possible outcomes of this ongoing predicament in the longer run. I would like to introduce two great researchers. Rabia Nasser first is an economist and researcher and co-founder of the Syrian Center for Policy Research. His areas of expertise and research include macroeconomic policy, inclusive growth, poverty, and socio-economic impact, assessment of conflict. He holds a MSc in economics from Leicester University in the UK, and his latest paper relating to subject that will be published soon is Energy and Conflict Nexus in Syria. Be sure not to miss it. And the second researcher is Sinan Hatahit, is a senior researcher fellow at the Sharq Forum, Omran for Strategic Studies, and a research associate in the Wartime and Post-Conflict in Syria project of the Middle Eastern Direction Program at the Robert Schuman for Advanced Studies in the European University Institute. Hatahit's research and interests include the dynamics of Syria's national and local economies, non-state actors, the Kurdish political movement, and the emerging regional order in the Middle East and North Africa. His latest paper on the subject was published a few weeks ago with the European University Institute and co-written with Karam Sha'ar, entitled Syria's Electricity Sector After a Decade of War, a Comprehensive Assessment. Before turning to our two great speakers, I would ask if it's possible, because I know it's always better for the people intervening, if it's possible for you to put your screen. Obviously, it's not an obligation, but I feel it's always better for us to have a bit more contact, if it's possible. Thank you very much. And again, thank you, Rabia, Sinan, to be with us today. And thank you all for being here for this presentation. So we'll start with you, Rabia. How has the energy sector influenced policies of the Syrian states in the past decades? Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph, and it's my pleasure to be with you today. If we divided this between pre-conflict and conflict, because I think it's a different story about the role of energy, and we are talking about energy. It's not just the electricity; it's about the oil, gas, and electricity, and production, the transforming and use of the energy. So it's very comprehensive sector that we have to look for to understand the impact of energy on, first, on the development in Syria pre-conflict and during the conflict. I just want to highlight a few points because of the limited time that we have. The first thing is the global energy policy, which is I would say, the source of injustice, inequality in the globe and in the region. So it's very important to take a look to understand the global impact on the energy sector and all the influences that have on the region, especially our region, because it's very rich in terms of natural resources. In this regard, we can have a lot of examples about the superior of economic sphere on comparing to the political and social spheres in the global system. And this affected the energy sector, as we can understand, the transnational companies and its role, the interference in terms of the energy policies from the main global power, which increase a lot the inequalities in the globe, affecting the sustainability and environment, and of course affecting the increasing of poverty and inequalities in the developing countries, including Syria. So this is one part that translated into military actions, like in the Gulf Wars and invasion of Iraq, and reflected in a huge conflict in terms of the pipelines that cross between the energy sources and mainly Europe. Now, so this is very important part to understand why this is a huge increase of inequalities because of how to use, produce, and consume the energy from the global perspective. The other side is the regional perspective. We have like 40% almost from the proven natural resources, and especially in oil and natural gas in the region, and this increase a huge geopolitical conflicts in the region and even beyond that. And this affects Syria intensively in terms of subsidies, in terms of the pipelines, in terms of the fueling conflict and fueling authoritarian regimes in the Gulf and in Syria, Egypt, etc. So it's very important as well to take this into consideration to see how this affects. For example, the subsidies from the Gulf countries to Syrian regimes in the 70s changed the paradigm of development. And the sanctions on the same regime in the 80s also shift the development in Syria in a different direction. Another example is how the Syrian young people just travel to the Gulf countries, leave Syria with a low equilibrium economic development to find their opportunities in the Gulf countries in a very bad labor conditions. So it's it's another factor that we have to look in this regard. Inside Syria, and I'm sorry for this, but I have to just separate the different level of analysis that we have to look for the energy sector. Inside Syria, we have like 1 per 1,000 of the proven oil and natural gas. We have this kind of, so it's not very rich, it's not very poor in terms of the natural resources. And in terms of the level of development, we are talking about authoritarian regime. Before the conflict, we have very different, I would say, different factors that we have to look, or different policies. The first policy is the pillage. So it's an authoritarian regime, take the oil and natural gas and electricity as a huge source of pillage, a huge rent-seeking policy. It's very important for incentives within the region. With the increase of production of oil in the 90s and gas in the 2000s, so we have this continuation of using this as a pillage, which would harm the economy and increase this elite, which is controlling the political and economic life inside Syria. The second important policy is the low-priced or subsidized derivatives. So it's very important in countries like Syria, Egypt, for example, which is not huge, very rich in the resources, that we have this low prices of energy because we have low income, low wages. So it's a low equilibrium development that you can't break through one of those sides without looking for the others. So the government, after the reduction in oil production since the 1997, they start to all the time press the idea of reducing the subsidies. This is a new liberal policy that it's very welcomed by the mainstream reforms in the world. But at the same time, it was harming the economy and harming the living of the Syrians because the other side of the economy is not working. So you are increasing the cost of the life of the Syrians without having the alternatives. So it's another side of the rent seeking that shifts the burden from the government to the people. The third policy is the lack of efficiency. So you can see, besides the pillage and the huge contracts between the transnational companies and the government and within the government elite, we have the lack of efficiency in the ministries and the technical teams that work on this. Our obvious evidence that we have almost 29% in 2010 as a loss or waste in the electricity production, which is comparing to the international standards, to all international standards, it's a huge one. So it's third of the production. We're losing the third of the production because of the lack of efficiency in terms of the technical side and because of the low corruption or the corruption within the government level, not within the elite that controlling the country. The country depended hugely on oil in terms of the public budget and in terms of exports, which affect badly the other sectors that could be producing more growth on a sustainable way before the conflict. So I will say that the energy policy before the conflict increased inequalities and increased the dependency on natural resources compared to the other productive sector, which is important part of the conflict, but it's not the top root of the conflict. So the top root of the conflict still in Syria, not an economic reasons, it's the political reasons, which huge suppression of the people and the society from, at least this is as a CPR analysis during the last 10 years, this is our main conclusion. During the conflict, I will briefly say that we have a shift from the energy as a source of inequalities. And I have to say, we have most of the production of oil in the most deprived region in Syria. So this is another regional inequalities as well. We have a shift toward different policies. The policies that used by regime first and then by different actors to first direct destruction for the infrastructure or for the grid transmit for electricity, for the power stations. We can list this.
We'll come back to this during the crisis.
Yeah.
Afterwards.
Okay. If you like, I will mention we have a shift in the conflict toward using different policies that become for part of the actors as an objective to control the rent or to control the energy supply as part of it, and then as part of the rent and spoils of what they called it a recovery or reconstruction after the end of big military operations. I will stop here if this is, give a brief about energy sector. If there is more, I can elaborate.
Thank you, Rabia, for this great first picture. I'll turn to you now, Sinan. What was the status of the electrical sector before the war, please?
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you everyone for attending the seminar today. I will start with a very important point, is that from a regime static point of view, electricity generation and distribution were central in the policies and the Syrian official modernization narrative. We have to remember that in the 60s, when the Ba'ath came to power, electricity was not spread all over the country. It was concentrated in the urban city gathering, and only few of the rural region received electricity in regular quantities. So the regime, as part, and Ba'ath as a part of their political commitments, as well as narrative, as well as propaganda, was to establish a fair model of economy. And part of it was, the most important part of it was this electricity, along with education. So we've seen a spur of both of these two services across the country in terms of distributing electricity to the smallest areas in urban and rural regions, as well as schools, at least primary schools. So since the 60s, Ba'ath consecutive governments have heavily intervened in the sector. First, by reinforcing the state control over the complete chain of production, from fuel procurement to electricity distribution to every household and industrial outlet. And second, by investing in building new generation transmitters and distribution grids. Lastly, as Rabia mentioned, is also by subsidizing its production and distribution. Electricity production in Syria was predominantly based on thermal power plants, primarily using fossil fuels and fuel in the 70s. Then we saw a transition toward gas in the late 90s and early 2000s, mainly because there was a decline in oil production and an increase in gas production. So it became financially more suitable to bring in thermal power plants that use gas for electricity generation, and also because it's easier to use the produced gas locally. Doesn't have to be transported into pipelines, doesn't have to be liquefied. So it also gave the regime a considerable cut in logistical cost, and there was already a policy to sell oil, crude oil, and then import refined oil products. So in the early 2000s, we saw this shift towards gas and combined gas, also generators. And we've seen a heavy, let's say, European footprint in adapting this technology. So we've seen Siemens that built at least built two power generator. We also seen considerable engagement from Italian and Greek companies, as well as the Japanese, who also gave credits, long period credits, to the Syrian regime and state, in order to also finance some of these projects. Up until the eruption of the Syrian conflict, the country had enough fuel resources to cover most of this oil and gas needs for electricity generation. There was, however, a need towards the end of the 2000s, especially in 2008, 9, and 10, to get their hands more on gas. And we've seen that the AGP, that is now, we've been hearing more about it lately in the media, the Aras gas pipeline has been used to transport some of the gas from Egypt to Syria. In 2011, the percentage of, so just before at the eve of the Syrian revolution, the percentage of electricity power generation by oil and gas constituted nearly 93% of the total electric energy produced. 53% was generated using natural gas, and 40% was generated using heavy and light oil. Only 7%. Sorry, I'm hearing some voices. So only 7% was produced by hydroelectrical generators situated on the Euphrates Valley. 3 of them, all of situated on the Euphrates Valley. To be honest, the electrical sector, the electricity sector in Syria, even though it was suffering from some shedding, so there was some hours where urban gathering didn't get enough electricity, where there was some cuts and some also rationalization of, let's say, of electricity. The overall status was still, or the overall shape was still correct. The problem was that the electricity generation was not advancing at the same pace of the demand. And there has been a surge in electricity demand in the 2000s because of 2 main factors. The first one, there has been an increased industrialization in urban areas, especially around Damascus and also in Aleppo, which required more electricity to run the industry. This is the first reason. And the second reason is the change in habits and consumer habits. So we've seen more power-hungry appliances be part of each household in Syria, like, for example, air conditioning, bigger TVs, bigger also refrigerators, and so on and so forth. So also the consumption on personal household has increased. The residential sector dominated the electricity energy consumption, and by the late 90s, a layered tariff was introduced in the market, in a sense where households and customers that are consuming more energy will be taxed or will be responsible for paying a bigger fee than the households or customers that are consuming less. And the rationale behind this layered tariff is to increase access to electricity energy in rural areas and poor neighborhoods in the city. Access to electrical engineering was generally satisfactory, as high electrification levels has been achieved. 99% of cities and towns in Syria had electricity. And the bill for electrical energy was a small percentage of the household expenditure on average. However, as Rabia said very well, it needed structural reforms to meet the growing consumer demands, reduce the gap with the supply, and shrink the significant technical and non-technical losses, which was very high, with around 27% in 2011. The preconized technical and not technical losses in total shouldn't exceed the 15% in countries of the similar shape, similar economy, and similar size of Syria. In other countries, it should be even lower, around 5%. But we see here that Syria was among the countries that has the biggest losses in terms of transmission in electricity. In 2010, Syria had laid the foundation for encouraging private investment in the sector, but couldn't put it in place, due to the conflict that erupted soon after. This also joins what Rabia was telling us as a part of load balancing or load shedding on the people and the private sector, and a way also of the public sector to retrieve itself slowly and gradually from electricity. So after years of central control of the electricity, the regime decision to allow the private sector to intervene was really part of this, let's say, larger offloading and liberalization strategy. However, the possibility of witnessing such private and international investment, regardless of of the conflict, was still slim due to unattractive and relatively low domestic electricity tariffs. So for that, in order to succeed, there should have been also some incentives for the private sector to intervene, which the regime didn't put a comprehensive policy to justify it.
Thank you, Sinan. Thank you, Sinan. I'll come back to you now, Rabia. We'll enter more current period. In your mind, in your opinion, what is the impact of the lack of, please, everyone, unmute, mute your micro when the speakers are speaking. So, in your opinion, Rabia, what is the impact of the lack of oil derivatives and other energy resources on production, especially agriculture and manufacturing economy? And what are the Syrian government primary response to this crisis?
Yes, I think there is different stages within the conflict in terms of policies. And I think if we can categorize those policies, I can mention first, and especially for the energy sector, two main policies in 2011 was major policies for this sector. The first one is the conflict-centered policy, that this source of revenue is very important for the war, for the conflict, for the regime. So it was the transformation of this huge resource, or the surplus of this resource, any kind of rent related to this, to fund the conflict, because this is a major part of the continuity of the regime. And if we add for this the reserves, most of the external reserves in the central bank is a product of the surplus in this sector. So this is one side, that you transform all the main activities. For example, the government decided to stop the investment even before that there is a huge instability in terms of the military operations, toward funding the military and security forces. So this is a major policy that started in 2011. And the other major policy is the sanctions. The external actors who are producing oil in Syria and exporting for us technical equipment for electricity from the West countries, they withdrew from the country in 2012, which create a huge shock for the production, especially in the light oil. It's almost 45% of the oil drop because of the sanctions. Of course, this impact of the sanctions didn't continue, because after 2013 and on, it was the conflict which you can't produce. It's not about the sanctions, it's about the ability to access to the oil and to the refineries and to the stations. So this is one side of the policies that started in this regard. After that, we have the conflict within the conflict on the energy. So most of the oil is in the northeast of Syria, and it's quickly become outside of the control of the regime. And most of the power station, as Sinan said, it is under the control of the regime, because most of it is in the west of the country. So that's why you can see during the conflict, the drop in the electricity production is almost between 35% and 45%, depends on the year. But in oil, the drop was reached 95%. Now the production of oil during the conflict dropped from 380,000 barrels per day in 2010 to almost, now we are talking about almost 90,000, mostly with the autonomous administration. While the gas, we have a drop between, now it's around 45%. And the last year, because of the corona, we have a huge impact as well, additional impact on this, and I will come to that later. So it's conflict-centered policies. It's started with the regime, then it became a policy that adapted by different non-state actors. If we take a very famous ISIS policy, that they use the oil, the controlling of these resources to fuel the conflict and to make finance for their activities and for their military operations. So this is another policy. But on parallel of this, which continue after that, is the destruction of the infrastructure and the energy of the other actors. So you have kind of like, for example, if you are talking about destruction of the power station, if it's under the control of other actors, but also the collective punishment that you prevent or deprive a society, a complete society, from all derivatives or all from electricity, because it's in the opposition side or in the other side. And I think we witness a substantial injustice in this regard in different military operations in Syria. So the collective punishment is what was another policy. There is the conflict economy part, which is for example, the oil. Until now, we can see that between the enemies, we have this transformation that all of you know about it. That there is an exchange of oil derivatives and electricity, gas, and you have commission and royalties for the actors who are playing between those actors on the ground. And this is a very important part of which, against all what they call it a moral slogan for different military actors, that they use this conflict economy to fund and to use it as spoils for the military part and for the security services. The fourth policy is the geopolitical one. So I can't fund the Russian, I can give them a privilege, which is giving them more spaces for exploration, production, distribution. And we have this in the gas fields. We have it in different electric power stations, and of course in the exploration inside the country about the oil and supervision of this. You can see this relation in the import of fuel from Iran. Because of the huge drop, we have this support from Iran and its loans, besides the privilege of having more investment in the sector. So the geopolitical part is very important. Of course, we can see that the export of electricity from Turkey to the controlled area by the opposition groups, and you can see the role of the Americans in protecting the oil in the autonomous administration as well. So this is another part of this complicated issue. And I will reach now to the corona part, that we have an external factor that reduce the production and affect the total economy mechanism as well, above all the other factors. But if we come to the government policy regarding the subsidies, the government want to collect revenue during the conflict from the people, from the economy. The economy destroyed, deteriorated on all sides. The foundation of the economy in terms of governance, human capital, productivity destroyed, and the government continue with the same policy that they want to collect revenue from the investors, small investors, or from the ordinary people. And they don't have income. They can't afford their liberalization of the subsidies of the oil derivatives and of electricity prices. So it's always that they increase the prices for the people and the economy who can't afford to do so. This reduces the production, increase the deterioration of the exchange rate, and increase the cost of imports. So it's a vicious cycle that we can't, it's without solution. It just reduced the production again. It's just destroyed the activities again and again. Now, the second point.
Yeah, Rabia,
yeah,
if you could be a bit, because we have, again, two other questions. I want to select time to people to intervene at the end. If you can conclude on this issue.
Okay, because I want to reach why after the end of the huge military operations, we have the same failure. So the lack of, it's not just that about the energy policy from the supply side. This is my point. It's not that now we have a lack of production side. We have a lack from demand side. If the people cannot invest because of the rule of the regime and distributing the spoils between the international actors and between the elite, the economic elite, you are preventing the people from being part of the recovery or any kind of new activities in the economy. So it's not that your energy production is constraining your recovery, it's your policies toward the people to generate their income, to increase the demand for energy is the other part of the story. So you can see that even if we increase the electricity production, we still have the same problem because it's the machine of the economy which is not working and the industry is not working, the agriculture. It's not just that we have lack of energy. And I will stop here.
Thank you, Rabia. Sorry for this, because just want to let time for a bit of discussion among us. And I'm sure a lot of participants have already started, and I will come back to you on the issue of the latest deal regarding the Jordan, Egypt, and Syria, what political implication it has. But I'll just turn now to Sinan, maybe to come back on the electrical sector. How did the conflict affect the sector? What is the impact of the electricity crisis on production and the economy?
Thank you, Joseph. Well, the conflict has created several new challenges and strains on the sector. And ultimately, it led to around a 60% drop in energy supply at the peak of the war in 2015. Physical damage to electricity infrastructure from the conflict has been severe, but it was mostly the generation capacity that was attained. The transmission grid, despite all the looting and also destruction, has still maintained a partial connectivity and was still able to run through different areas of control. And we've seen several cases where actually it has been negotiated between the opposition and the regime and the SDF forces to allow some technical and engineering teams to intervene and to reestablish some of these transmission grids. But it is mostly the generation capacity that has been attained. And even then, I will get a little bit more to details left, later on in this question, hasn't been also that drastic. According to initial damage assessment, power lines and substations are partially functional also. Also some significant transmission links are still in place, especially when it comes to the big hubs that connects the different regions. However, in terms of power generation, so we had 11 fossil fuel run power plants in 2011 at the eve of the Syrian conflict. Only 3 of them were destructed. The first one is Zayzoun in Idlib, was completely destructed. First by regime air raids, and a second time by HTS, as well as the Turkmeni Islamic Party, that also looted what was left of the power grid of the power plant. The second one is the Aleppo thermal station, which was the biggest one in Syria before the conflict, and it was targeted by the regime forces at certain point, but it also suffered a lot from ISIS attacks and looting. And today, from the 5 thermal turbines that are operating in the station, none of them is working. The third one is Al-Taim, which is a relatively small power generator in Deir ez-Zor, was also destructed. Their combined nameplate capacity, this 3, is around 1.7 megawatts, which is around 20% of this total installed capacity on the nation scale. So 21% of the generation capacity was completely destroyed. It is of course a high percentage, but if we take in consideration the decrease also in demand, one, because of the change of nature of consumption, the drop in industrial demand and for electricity, but also the large exodus of population, this drop is still relatively, in electricity generation, is still relatively lower than the drop in demand. There are, of course, in addition to this 11 thermal power plants, there's 3 hydroelectric dams on the Euphrates. These remain partially operational despite infrequent maintenance and neglect, and they were also disconnected repeatedly from the grid. But just in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, it was reconnected back to Hama hub, and it is producing its share of electricity. However, they haven't been operating at the biggest capacity because of 2 reasons. First one is that they are archaic in terms of technology. They are the oldest one that exists in the country. They were built in the 1970s from Soviet technology, and they haven't been updated or upgraded. So the technology itself is not the best. And the second reason is also the declining level of water in the Euphrates, mainly because of Turkey policies in reducing the water flow to Syria. The impact of the Syrian conflict on the electricity sector can be categorized into 3 broad groups. The first one is the damages inflicted on the power plants and the transmission grids. The second one is the loss of fuel and its consequences on the electricity production. And the third one is the direct cost of rehabilitating the damaged infrastructure, and the indirect cost also caused by the interruption of power, either in terms of loss of production, or in industry or agriculture. So I mentioned 3 power plants that were completely destroyed. That doesn't mean that the remaining 8 were completely spared. They were also attacked. For example, Mahrada, Zara, and Tishreen were repeatedly attacked, and because they were on front lines between the opposition and the regime. And if we take into consideration Also this impact or partial impact based on the latest numbers produced and published by the Ministry of Electricity in Damascus. Today we stand at 65% of the original capacity for electricity generation 10 years earlier. The transmission lines were still targeted during battles, as I mentioned earlier. In 2019, around 1/3 of the transmission lines and grids were either destroyed or stolen. But it's the cost for the repair, their rehabilitation is relatively lower than the cost entailed in repairing a power generator plant, and it doesn't demand a very high level of expertise. So this is why even though it has been impacted, it's not the largest reason for this drop in electricity generation. Another part of the infrastructure that was also targeted is the gas pipeline. And this gas pipeline has caused significant electricity supply disruption. As Rabia mentioned, most of the gas and oil production is in northeast Syria and the east of the country, whereas the major power plants are in the west of the countries. So for example, when the pipelines in the Syrian desert were targeted west of Palmyra, and also the pipelines connecting Asha'ir field to Ibla, the gas processing plant, we witnessed long power cuts in Homs and Deir ez-Zor, as well as in Hama. The Arab gas pipeline, the AGP, also that was supplying gas from Egypt, was targeted a couple of times, and it has caused some power outage in Damascus governorate, not because Egyptian gas was not being pumped anymore, because it has stopped sometime in 2011, but because this same infrastructure, the AGP, is also used for transporting Syrian gas to power plants. So finally, as for the production capacity, the war considerably weakened the despite. So I mentioned that there have been a loss in the nameplate. So the nameplate is the capacity, the upper limit that the power generator can actually produce electricity. But even if this is remain impact, the production capacity is directly dependent on the quantities of oil that is procured and distributed to the power generation. So here we say we've seen the impact of the loss of the regime control over oil and gas, also in the capacity of these power plants to procure fuel. In 2021, for example, to operate at a total capacity, the Syrian generation, the Syrian power stations need 7,000 tons of fuel per day and 18 million cubes of gas daily, whereas the quantity that is today available only covers around 60% of the gas need and 40% of the fuel need. So even with the remaining capacity, which is more than enough to meet the current demand, there is no enough oil procurement to run and to run it at its full capacity. Thank you.
Thank you, Sinan.